the nanny arrived to take care of the millionaire's daughter in his mansion. She was paralyzed when she saw her mother's photo in a black frame. Mia had never seen anything quite like the Wainwright mansion. The sprawling estate was tucked deep in the hills of upstate New York, surrounded by thick forests that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. As she stepped out of the car and gazed at the mansion, a wave of nerves washed over her. She was there for one reason, to take care of Mr. Wainwright's daughter, Emma, who had been dealing with a mysterious illness for the past year. The first thing Mia noticed upon entering the mansion was the eerie silence. For such a large house, it felt oddly devoid of life. Her footsteps echoed softly as the butler led her through the halls, each one more extravagant than the last. There was a coldness to the place that made her uncomfortable, but she kept her focus. She needed this job, especially after everything that had happened in her own life. When they reached the living room, Mia froze. Hanging on the wall, framed in elegant black, was a photo of a woman who looked strikingly familiar. Her heart began to pound as she stepped closer to get a better look. The woman in the photograph was her mother, but she had no idea why her picture would be here, in this mansion. It was a portrait she hadn't seen before, but there was no doubt, it was her mother. The butler, noticing her reaction, cleared his throat. "Is everything all right, miss?" he asked, his voice neutral but observant. Mia blinked, pulling herself together. "Yes, sorry. I just thought I recognized someone." She tried to mask the tremor in her voice as she turned away from the photograph, but inside, her mind was racing. Who was this man? And how did he know her mother? She had no time to think it over as she was quickly introduced to Mr. Wainwright himself, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a stern demeanor. He looked her up and down, his expression unreadable. "Miss Matthews," he greeted her, his voice deep and controlled. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. My daughter, Emma, has been unwell, and I expect you'll provide her with the best care." Mia nodded, still shaken but determined to remain professional. "Of course, Mr. Wainwright. I'll do everything I can to help Emma." He gave a brief nod, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than she expected. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving her with a sinking feeling in her stomach. As Mia settled into her role at the Wainwright mansion, she quickly learned that Emma was a quiet, introspective girl who spent most of her time in her room. She was only 7 years old, but there was a wisdom in her eyes that seemed far beyond her years. Her illness, though undiagnosed, had drained much of her energy, leaving her frail and withdrawn. Mia could see the sadness in Emma's gaze and felt a deep sympathy for her. The mansion itself added to the heavy atmosphere. It was an old building, steeped in history, and Mia often wondered what stories its walls could tell. Each room had an antique charm, but also a coldness that made her feel like she was always being watched. The staff kept to themselves, performing their duties with quiet efficiency, never engaging in conversation more than necessary. There was an air of formality in everything they did, making Mia feel like an outsider in a world she didn't fully understand. Emma, despite her illness, seemed to warm up to Mia quickly. In their quiet moments together, Mia read stories to her, hoping to offer some comfort. Emma listened intently, often staring out the window as if lost in her own thoughts. One day, while they were in the garden, Emma asked Mia a question that caught her off guard. "Do you think people who make mistakes deserve to be forgiven?" Emma's voice was soft, but there was a depth to her question that felt far too mature for her age. Mia hesitated. "I think it depends on the mistake, and whether they're truly sorry for it." Emma nodded but didn't say anything more. She seemed satisfied with the answer, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. As the days passed, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from her. The picture of her mother still haunted her thoughts. Whenever she asked the staff about it, they either avoided the question or acted like they didn't know what she was talking about. It was as if the woman in the photograph didn't exist. And then there was Mr. Wainwright. His presence loomed over the mansion, even when he wasn't around. He was often away on business, leaving Mia and Emma alone for long stretches of time, but whenever he was home, there was a tension in the air. He was a man of few words, his interactions with Mia strictly professional, but she sensed that he was hiding something dark. One evening, as Mia was tucking Emma into bed, the little girl spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daddy keeps secrets. Big ones." Mia froze for a moment, then looked at Emma. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emma's eyes were heavy with sleep, but she managed to mutter, "I hear him talking when he thinks I'm not listening. He said he's sorry, for what happened." Mia's heart raced. What was Mr. Wainwright sorry for? And how was it connected to the photograph of her mother? As she closed Emma's bedroom door that night, Mia knew she needed answers. Whatever secrets Mr. Wainwright was keeping, they were tied to her past, and she was determined to uncover the truth. Mia's determination to uncover the truth about her mother grew stronger each day. The more time she spent in the mansion, the more she sensed the weight of its secrets. Every conversation with the staff was a dead end, and Mr. Wainwright's distant demeanor only heightened her suspicion. Something about the way he avoided eye contact whenever the topic of family came up unsettled her. One afternoon, while Emma was napping, Mia found herself wandering into Mr. Wainwright's study. She knew she shouldn't be there, but curiosity drove her forward. The room was lined with bookshelves, and the heavy scent of polished wood filled the air. On the large mahogany desk sat a leather-bound journal, partially hidden under a stack of papers. Mia's hands trembled as she flipped through the journal's pages. At first, they seemed ordinary, notes about business meetings, financial dealings, but then she found a series of entries from several years ago. The handwriting grew more erratic, the words more emotional. One passage caught her eye: "I can never forgive myself for what happened that night. I should have been more careful. Now she's gone, and nothing can bring her back. I've ruined lives. God help me, I don't know how to make it right." Mia's heart pounded. She knew in that moment that Mr. Wainwright was writing about her mother. Her hands gripped the edges of the journal, her mind racing with questions. What had he done? How was her mother involved? She wanted to confront him immediately, but she knew she had to tread carefully. The truth could change everything. Before she could process the information further, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made her snap the journal shut and slide it back into place. Mr. Wainwright entered the room, his expression stern as he noticed Mia standing near his desk. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was cold, filled with suspicion. Mia swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. I was just looking for a book for Emma." He didn't seem convinced. His eyes narrowed as he studied her, but after a tense pause, he simply nodded. "Emma's room is full of books. You don't need anything from my study." She nodded, retreating from the room with her pulse racing. She could feel his gaze on her as she left, and she knew that her time in the mansion was running out. Whatever secrets Mr. Wainwright was hiding, she was dangerously close to uncovering them, and she wasn't sure how far he'd go to protect them. Over the next few days, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she passed one of the mansion's staff in the hallways, their eyes seemed to linger on her just a little too long. It was as though they knew she had found something, but no one dared say a word. Meanwhile, Emma grew more comfortable with Mia, and their bond deepened. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Mia couldn't resist asking the question that had been gnawing at her since the day she saw the photo. "Emma," Mia began cautiously, "the photo of the woman in the black frame, do you know who she is?" Emma's small hand fiddled with a strand of her hair as she thought. "That's my grandma," she said simply, her voice soft. Mia's chest tightened. "Your grandma?" Emma nodded, her eyes distant. "Daddy doesn't like to talk about her. He gets really sad when I ask, so I don't ask anymore." Mia's heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The woman in the photograph wasn't just any connection, she was Emma's grandmother, and somehow, her mother. The realization left her breathless. How had her mother ended up in this family, and why had Mia never known? As Mia processed this, the weight of the situation grew. She realized she wasn't just a nanny in a strange mansion anymore, she was entangled in a web of secrets that connected her directly to Mr. Wainwright's hidden past. There were things in his life that had been carefully concealed for years, and Mia was about to unravel them. Days later, Mia came across another clue, this time in an unlikely place. While cleaning up after Emma's art project in the dining room, she noticed something odd about one of the old family portraits on the wall. There, tucked behind the frame, was a folded piece of paper. Her hands shaking, Mia pulled it free and carefully unfolded it. It was a letter, dated years ago, written in her mother's handwriting. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. If anyone finds out what really happened, everything will fall apart. I'm sorry I've been distant, but I can't face you knowing what I've done. Please forgive me." The letter was unfinished, but the message was clear. Her mother had been involved in something terrible, something that had left her ashamed and distant from Mia. And now Mia was standing in the same house where it all unfolded. She didn't know what to believe anymore. Was her mother guilty of some hidden crime, or had she been protecting herself from something even darker? The mounting pressure pushed Mia to her breaking point. Every day, she grew more uneasy, her mind racing with questions. Emma was the only thing that brought her peace, but even the innocent little girl was part of this tangled mess. Mia knew she had to make a choice, stay and uncover the full truth or walk away and never look back. One evening, after a long day with Emma, Mia found herself pacing in her room, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The unfinished letter from her mother had left her with more questions than answers, but it also confirmed one thing: her mother had been deeply involved in something within this mansion, something that had consumed her. Mia couldn't walk away now, not without understanding the full truth. She decided to confront Mr. Wainwright. Later that night, when the mansion was quiet, she made her way to his study. The large wooden doors loomed before her, but she pushed them open with a determined breath. Inside, Mr. Wainwright sat behind his desk, his head bowed as he worked on some paperwork. He looked up at the sound of the door creaking and raised an eyebrow at Mia's unexpected arrival. "Mia," he greeted, his voice steady but guarded. "Is something wrong?" Mia's heart pounded in her chest, but she had come too far to back down now. She stepped closer, her voice trembling but firm. "I know who the woman in the photo is. She was my mother." For a moment, there was only silence. Mr. Wainwright's face froze, his usual composure faltering as the weight of her words sank in. His hand tightened on the arm of his chair, and his eyes grew dark. "Your mother," he whispered, his voice low and filled with an emotion Mia couldn't place. "She worked for you, didn't she?" Mia continued, her voice gaining strength. "And something happened, something terrible. I found the letter she wrote. I need to know the truth." Mr. Wainwright stood slowly, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. His eyes met Mia's, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something other than cold detachment in his gaze. There was pain, deep and unspoken, etched into his features. "It was an accident," he finally said, his voice rough with years of buried guilt. "Your mother, she was working for me. She was a good woman, a kind soul. But one night, something went wrong. I was driving. It was raining. The roads were slick, and I lost control of the car." Mia's breath caught in her throat. The room seemed to spin around her as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Her mother hadn't just worked for the Wainwrights, she had died because of Mr. Wainwright's reckless actions. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I've lived with that guilt every day since. I couldn't face your family. I tried to help in other ways, but there was no way to make it right. Mia felt a storm of emotions swirl inside her: anger, sorrow, betrayal. She had come to this mansion to care for Emma, but now she was standing face to face with the man responsible for her mother's death. She had every reason to hate him, every reason to demand justice. But as she looked at Mr. Wainwright, she saw a broken man. A man who had been carrying the weight of his mistake for years. In that moment, Mia was faced with a choice: she could expose him, ruin his life, and ensure that he paid for what he had done. Or, she could walk away, knowing that he was already living with the consequences of his actions. Mia stood frozen in front of Mr. Wainwright, her heart pounding as the weight of his confession hung in the air. She had imagined this moment countless times in her head, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. Her mother's death had haunted her for years, and now, the truth was staring her in the face, wrapped in guilt and regret. Mr. Wainwright's gaze never left hers, but it was no longer the cold, distant look he had worn for so long. Instead, there was a raw vulnerability in his eyes, as though he was finally ready to confront the past he had buried so deeply. "I know I can never ask for your forgiveness," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But please, understand. I've lived with this every single day. I've tried to be the best father I can be to Emma, but I've failed in so many ways." Mia's hands trembled as a whirlwind of emotions flooded through her. Anger still simmered beneath the surface, but so did sadness and a strange sense of pity. She had come here for justice, but now, standing in front of this broken man, she didn't know if exposing him would bring her the peace she so desperately sought. Before she could respond, the soft sound of footsteps interrupted the tense silence. Emma appeared in the doorway, her small figure barely illuminated by the dim light of the study. Her wide eyes flicked between Mia and her father, sensing the weight of the moment even though she didn't fully understand it. "Is everything okay?" Emma asked, her voice soft but full of concern. Mia's heart clenched. She looked at Emma, this innocent little girl who had nothing to do with the tragedy that had unraveled years before. Emma didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this, to lose her father over something she couldn't possibly comprehend. In that moment, Mia realized that the truth, while important, might not be the key to healing. "Everything's fine, Emma," Mia said gently, forcing a small smile for the girl's sake. "Your dad and I were just talking." Emma hesitated for a moment, her curious eyes searching Mia's face for answers, but when she didn't find any, she nodded and slowly retreated back to her room. When she was gone, Mia turned back to Mr. Wainwright. Her emotions were still in turmoil, but she knew what she had to do. "I'm not going to tell anyone," Mia said, her voice steady. "Not because you don't deserve it, but because Emma doesn't. She needs you, and whatever happened in the past, it can't be undone. I've spent too many years grieving for my mother. It's time for me to let go." Mr. Wainwright's face crumpled with relief, and for the first time, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice broken. "You have no idea what this means." Mia didn't respond. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not entirely, but she knew that holding on to her anger would only continue to hurt her. The man standing before her had made a terrible mistake, but he was already living with the consequences. With one last look, Mia turned and walked out of the study, leaving behind the weight of the past that had burdened her for so long. In the days that followed, Mia found herself feeling lighter than she had in years. It wasn't that the pain of losing her mother had disappeared, but something had shifted inside her. For the first time, she was able to let go of the constant need for answers, for justice. She had finally made peace with the fact that no amount of truth could bring her mother back, and that some wounds were best healed by moving forward. Emma, unaware of the heavy conversations that had taken place between Mia and her father, continued to grow more attached to her. Their time together became a source of comfort for Mia, and she found joy in caring for the little girl. Despite everything, Emma was innocent, a bright light in the shadow of the mansion's dark past. Mr. Wainwright, though still reserved, began to change as well. He was more present with Emma, more attentive in ways Mia hadn't seen before. She noticed the subtle ways he tried to make amends, not through words, but through actions. He spent more time with his daughter, sitting by her side while Mia read stories, taking her for walks in the garden, and being the father Emma had always needed. It was clear that the weight of his past mistakes still haunted him, but he was making an effort to be better, for Emma's sake. Mia's decision to stay, at least for now, wasn't an easy one. She knew she could leave the mansion behind and never look back, but something inside her told her she wasn't quite ready to leave Emma. There was a bond between them that went beyond the simple relationship of a nanny and child. Emma had brought a sense of purpose back into Mia's life, and in return, Mia had given Emma a stability she hadn't known before. One afternoon, as Mia and Emma sat in the garden watching the leaves fall from the trees, Emma looked up at Mia with her wide, curious eyes. "Do you think things can get better, even when bad things happen?" Mia smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "Yes, I do. Sometimes it takes time, and sometimes it takes forgiving people, even when it's hard. But things can get better." Emma thought about that for a moment, then rested her head on Mia's shoulder. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered. Mia felt a lump in her throat. "I'm glad I'm here too." In that moment, Mia realized that healing didn't always come from confronting the past or seeking revenge. Sometimes, it came from the small moments, the quiet acts of love and forgiveness that helped people move forward. She had come to the mansion looking for answers, but what she had found was something far more valuable, a chance to heal, not just for herself, but for those around her. As the weeks passed, the tension that once filled the Wainwright mansion began to ease. Mia noticed subtle changes in Mr. Wainwright's behavior. He was no longer as cold and distant as when she had first arrived. There were moments, small but significant, where he seemed to be making an effort to connect with Emma and, in his own quiet way, with Mia. He hadn't asked for forgiveness directly, but his actions spoke louder than any apology could. Despite the shift in the atmosphere, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that her time at the mansion was coming to an end. She had come here to care for Emma, but along the way, she had uncovered so much more than she had anticipated. The weight of her mother's death, the secrets that Mr. Wainwright had kept for so long, and the emotional toll it had taken on both of them had created a bond she hadn't expected. One evening, after putting Emma to bed, Mia found herself once again in the study, but this time, she wasn't there to snoop. She needed closure, not just for herself, but for her mother's memory. She stood in front of Mr. Wainwright, her heart steady but determined. "I'm leaving soon," Mia said quietly, her voice calm. Mr. Wainwright looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face. He didn't speak right away, but his eyes searched hers, as if trying to understand what she was feeling. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice softer than usual. Mia sighed, glancing around the room that had once felt so suffocating but now seemed almost peaceful. "I've made my peace with what happened," she said. "But I can't stay here forever. It's time for me to move on." Mr. Wainwright's expression tightened for a moment, but he nodded, understanding. "I suppose I can't ask you to stay," he said. "But I want you to know, Mia, that I'm grateful for what you've done for Emma, and for me." Mia's chest tightened at his words. She hadn't expected gratitude from him, and it touched her more than she cared to admit. "I didn't do it for you," she said softly. "I did it for Emma. And for my mother." Mr. Wainwright gave a small nod, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Your mother was a good woman. I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know," Mia replied. "And I think she'd want me to forgive you." The room was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mia knew that this was her moment of release. She had found the answers she had been seeking, but more importantly, she had found a way to let go of the anger and grief that had haunted her for so long. "I'll be leaving in a few days," Mia said finally, her voice firm but gentle. Mr. Wainwright looked at her, his eyes heavy with unspoken words. "I'll make sure you have everything you need," he said quietly. "And Mia, thank you." With that, Mia turned and left the study, the weight of her decision settling over her like a blanket. She had chosen her path, and though it wasn't the one she had expected, it was the one that felt right. The day of Mia's departure came quietly. She had packed her things the night before, and now the morning sun streamed through the windows of her room, casting long shadows on the walls. The mansion felt different, less foreboding, as though the heavy secrets it held were beginning to lift. Emma was still asleep, unaware that Mia was leaving that day, and the thought of saying goodbye to her tugged at Mia's heart. As Mia walked down the grand staircase with her suitcase in hand, she found Mr. Wainwright waiting for her at the bottom. He was dressed in his usual suit, but there was a softness to his demeanor that hadn't been there before. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I thought you'd want to say goodbye to Emma before you go," he said, his voice low. Mia hesitated. She had wanted to leave quietly, without causing any more emotional upheaval for Emma, but she knew she couldn't leave without saying a proper farewell. "You're right," she said, setting her suitcase down by the door. Together, they walked to Emma's room, where the little girl was still curled up under her blankets, her breathing soft and steady. Mia sat on the edge of her bed, gently brushing a lock of hair from Emma's face. "Emma," she whispered softly, "it's time to wake up." Emma stirred, blinking sleepily as she looked up at Mia. A slow smile spread across her face as she reached for Mia's hand. "Are we going to read another story today?" she asked. Mia's heart ached, but she smiled warmly. "Not today, sweetie. I have to leave now." Emma's expression shifted, confusion and sadness filling her eyes. "Leave? But, why?" Mia swallowed the lump in her throat. "It's time for me to go, Emma. But you'll be okay. Your dad is here, and he's going to take good care of you." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes, and she clung to Mia's hand. "But I don't want you to go." Mia leaned in, wrapping her arms around Emma and holding her close. "I know, sweetie, I know. But you're a strong girl, and you have so much love around you. You're going to be just fine." Emma sobbed quietly into Mia's shoulder, and Mia held her for a long time, letting the moment stretch. When Emma finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, Mia kissed her forehead. "I'll never forget you," Mia whispered. "And I'll always carry you in my heart." Emma nodded, sniffling but trying to be brave. "I'll miss you, Mia." "I'll miss you too, Emma." As Mia stood to leave, Mr. Wainwright stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. Emma leaned into him, her tears still fresh, but there was a sense of understanding in her young eyes. She knew that things were changing, but that it wasn't the end. Mia gave one last glance at Mr. Wainwright, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw a man who was truly trying to be better, for himself and for Emma. He gave her a small, grateful nod, and with that, Mia turned and walked out of the room, her heart heavy but at peace. As she stepped out of the mansion and into the crisp autumn air, Mia felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. She had faced the ghosts of her past, made peace with the truth, and found a way to move forward. And as she walked away from the mansion, she knew that she had finally closed the chapter on her mother's death. Her future, for the first time in years, felt open and full of possibility. Mia walked down the long driveway of the Wainwright mansion, her suitcase rolling quietly behind her. The towering trees that lined the path swayed gently in the breeze, their golden leaves falling like whispers of the past. As she reached the gate, she paused for a moment, turning back to take one last look at the house that had changed everything for her. She had come to the mansion seeking a job, a fresh start, but what she had found was far more profound. The secrets, the grief, the hidden truths, they had all shaped her journey, but they no longer had the power to control her. She had faced the pain of her mother's death and the man responsible for it, and instead of letting anger consume her, she had chosen to forgive, for her own sake and for Emma's. Mia knew that her decision to leave wasn't an escape. It was a step forward, a chance to reclaim her life and begin again. She had found healing, not through revenge, but through understanding and compassion. And while the mansion and its occupants would always be a part of her story, they no longer defined her. As she pushed open the gate and stepped onto the road that stretched beyond the estate, Mia felt a quiet strength growing within her. She had been through so much, but she had survived. And now, the future was hers to shape. With one last glance at the mansion fading behind her, Mia smiled softly. She wasn't running anymore. She was ready to face whatever came next. Months later, Mia stood in a small, cozy apartment far from the Wainwright mansion. The air smelled of fresh coffee, and the sunlight streamed through the open window, casting a warm glow on the room. She had begun a new chapter in her life, working as a caregiver for children at a local community center, a job that brought her joy and fulfillment every day. Though the memories of her time at the mansion lingered, they no longer carried the weight they once had. Every now and then, she thought of Emma, wondering how the little girl was doing, but she knew that Emma was in good hands. She had seen a change in Mr. Wainwright, and she believed that he would be the father Emma needed. As she gazed out of the window, a sense of peace settled over Mia. She had found her way back to herself, and though the road had been difficult, it had led her to a place of healing and hope. The future, she knew, was full of promise. As you reached the end of this emotional journey, what moments resonated with you the most? Have you ever faced a situation where forgiveness seemed impossible, yet necessary for healing? Share your thoughts and reflections on Mia's story. How do you think her decision to forgive shaped her future? We'd love to hear your insights and personal experiences related to forgiveness, growth, and moving forward after tragedy.